To prepare for the AZ-104 certification and pass the exam successfully, candidates can choose Passcert latest Microsoft Azure Administrator Associate AZ-104 dumps for test preparation. We guarantee you can pass your Microsoft AZ-104 exam successfully and earn your Microsoft Certified Azure Administrator Associate certification. Question 1. You need to recommend a solution to automate the configuration for the finance department users. The solution must meet the technical requirements. What should you include in the recommended? A. Azure APB2C. B. Azure AD Identity Protection. C. An Azure Logic App and the Microsoft Identity Management (MIM) client. D. Dynamic groups and conditional access policies. Answer: D. Question 2. You need to meet the technical requirement for VM4. What should you create and configure? A. An Azure Notification Hub. B. An Azure Event Hub. C. An Azure Logic App. D. An Azure Services Bus. Answer: B. Question 3. You need to define a custom domain name for Azure AD to support the planned infrastructure. Which domain name should you use? A. ad.humongousInsurance.com. B. humongousinsurance.onmicrosoft.com. C. Humongous Insurance. Local. D. humongousinsurance.com. Answer: D. Question 4. You need to prepare the environment to meet the authentication requirements. Which 2 actions should you perform? Each correct answer presents part of the solution. Note each correct selection is worth 1 point. A. Azure Active Directory, AD, Identity Protection and an Azure Policy. B. A Recovery Services Vault and a Backup Policy. C. An Azure Key Vault and an Access Policy. D. An Azure Storage Account and an Access Policy. Answer: B, D. Question 5. You need to resolve the Active Directory issue. What should you do? A. From Active Directory users and computers, select the user accounts, and then modify the user principal name value. B. Run idfix.x, and then use the edit action. C. From Active Directory domains and trusts, modify the list of UPN suffixes. D. From Azure AD Connect, modify the outbound synchronization rule. Answer: B. Question 6. You need to implement a backup solution for App 1 after the application is moved. What should you create first? A. A recovery plan. B. An Azure backup server. C. A backup policy. D. A recovery services vault. Answer: D. Question 7. You need to move the blueprint files to Azure. What should you do? A. Generate a shared access signature, SAS. Map a drive, and then copy the files by using File Explorer. B. Use the Azure Import/Export service. C. Generate an access key. Map a drive, and then copy the files by using File Explorer. D. Use Azure Storage Explorer to copy the files. Answer: D. Question 8. You have an Azure subscription that contains an Azure Active Directory, Azure AD tenant named Contoso.com and an Azure Kubernetes Service, AKS, cluster named AKS1. An administrator reports that she is unable to grant access to AKS1 to the users in Contoso.com. You need to ensure that access to AKS1 can be granted to the Contoso.com users. What should you do first? A. From Contoso.com, modify the organization relationship settings. B. From Contoso.com, create an OAuth 2.0 authorization endpoint. C. Recreate AKS1. D. From AKS1, create a namespace. Answer: B. Question 9. You have an Azure Active Directory, Azure AD tenant named contosocloud.onmicrosoft.com. Your company has a public DNS zone for Contoso.com. You add Contoso.com as a custom domain name to Azure AD. You need to ensure that Azure can verify the domain name. Which type of DNS record should you create? A. PTR. B. MX. C. NSEC3. D. RRSIG. Answer: B. Question 10. You download an Azure Resource Manager template based on an existing virtual machine. The template will be used to deploy 100 virtual machines. You need to modify the template to reference an administrative password. You must prevent the password from being stored in plain text. What should you create to store the password? A. Azure Active Directory, AD, identity protection and an Azure policy. B. A recovery services vault and a backup policy. C. An Azure Key Vault and an access policy. D. An Azure Storage account and an access policy. Answer: C.